After I refused to fund my daughter's lavish wedding, she invited me to dinner with lawyers waiting at the table. I'm Martha. I'm 62, recently retired, and apparently the villain in my daughter's fairy tale wedding fantasy. Amber, my only child, got engaged to Greg about 6 months ago, and since then, it's been nonstop Pinterest boards, floral mood boards, venue tours, and guest list wars. At first, I was thrilled. She's my baby, and I've always imagined this moment. I figured we'd sit down over coffee, talk through ideas, maybe cry over a bridal magazine or two. What I didn't expect was to be handed a professionally printed, color-coded budget proposal that totaled just over $65,000. And what shocked me even more, Amber assumed I'd be footing the entire bill. It wasn't a question, it wasn't a conversation, it was presented to me like it was already decided. We figured it made sense for you to cover the wedding, she said, smiling like it was the most natural thing in the world. Greg, sitting beside her, nodded and added something about how his parents would handle the honeymoon, like it was some kind of business merger. I sat there blinking at the page, trying to find the part where this wasn't absolutely bonkers. $65,000. I asked her if she was joking. I genuinely hoped she was. But no, she was completely serious. She went on to explain how important this day was, how it had to be perfect, how all her friends were having these epic weddings, and how she didn't want to settle for basic. I was stunned. I told her flatly, no, I wasn't paying for that. I offered $15,000. That's what I'd saved, what I could afford. It wasn't pocket change. It was more than generous. I expected some pushback, maybe some disappointment. I did not expect what came next. Her face changed instantly, like I'd insulted her personally. $15,000? That doesn't even cover the venue deposit, she snapped. Greg just sat there awkwardly, like he wished he was anywhere else. You don't care about me, she said. You just want me to have some ugly courthouse wedding. I tried to explain, gently at first, then more firmly, that it wasn't about not caring. It was about reality. I'm retired. I live on a fixed income. I worked for decades as a teacher. I don't have $65,000 lying around for one party, no matter how beautiful it is. She didn't hear a word of it. She stood up mid-conversation and said she didn't want my pity money, that she'd figure it out without me, that I'd shown my true colors. Then she walked out of my house without looking back. That was 3 months ago. Since then, nothing. Not a single call. Not a message. Not even a forwarded email about cake tastings or RSVP counts. She blocked me on social media, and I've heard through a cousin that she's telling people I'm dead to her. Over a wedding. Over a check I wouldn't write. I sit in my quiet house now, surrounded by framed photos of her at every age, from her first steps to her high school graduation, to that time I held her hand through a breakup when she thought her heart would never heal. I wasn't perfect, but I was always there. I never thought refusing to fund a luxury wedding would be the moment she decided to walk away for good. But here we are. And the worst part is, I don't even miss the wedding. I miss her. A few weeks passed in silence, the kind that wraps itself around your chest like a heavy wool blanket soaked in rain. I went about my days like a ghost inside my own routine, grocery shopping with a list I didn't even look at, watering the same drooping houseplants, watching reruns of shows I'd already memorized just so the television would speak to me when no one else would. And then, out of nowhere, on a Tuesday afternoon while I was folding towels that still smelled faintly like the detergent Amber had picked out during her last visit, my phone rang. Her name lit up the screen like a flare in the dark. Amber. For a moment, I couldn't move. My hand hovered over the phone, unsure whether to answer or let it ring out like every hope I'd tried to bury since she stormed out of my life. I answered. Her voice was soft, a little too soft, like she'd rehearsed it in the mirror. She said she'd been thinking a lot, that things had gotten out of hand, that she missed me, that Greg missed me too. She mentioned Franco's, her favorite Italian place since she was 17, and went through that weird phase where she pretended she was fluent in Italian because she watched Under the Tuscan Sun one too many times. She said she'd made a reservation for Friday at 7. Just the two of us. I thought maybe we could talk, she said. Start fresh. I said yes before she even finished the sentence. I didn't ask questions. I didn't press for details. I just nodded even though she couldn't see me and said, I'd like that. That Friday, I took the burgundy dress out of the back of my closet. It was the one I wore to her high school graduation, her first solo violin recital, her college induction ceremony. I hadn't touched it in years, but it still fit, barely. The seams strained a little around the shoulders, and the fabric clung tighter at the waist than I remembered, but I wore it anyway. I even put on the pearl studs she gave me for Mother's Day 5 years ago and spritzed myself with the rose sandalwood perfume she used to steal from my dresser as a teenager. I stared at myself in the mirror and tried to see the mother she used to run to for advice. The one who knew exactly how she liked her mashed potatoes or which side of the bed she curled up on when she couldn't sleep. I got to Franco's 10 minutes early. I always do. It was dimly lit and smelled like garlic and red wine, and all the meals we used to share when she still wanted to be seen with me in public. I told the hostess I was meeting my daughter. She smiled, asked if I'd like to wait at the bar or be seated. I chose a booth near the window, hoping maybe Amber would see me and recognize the silhouette of her mother in that old burgundy dress. I sat there with my hands folded neatly on the linen napkin. Waited as the minutes slid by. 7:10, 7:15. I told myself she was just running late. Traffic. Maybe a last-minute work call. Maybe she changed shoes at the last second like she always used to, and now she was hobbling down the sidewalk, trying not to twist an ankle in those stupid stilettos she swore made her look grown. By 7:30, I'd memorized every couple in the restaurant. By 7:40, I'd ordered water just to have something to sip. By 7:50, I started counting the breaths between heartbeats and wondering if I'd misunderstood the whole thing. At 8:01, I finally picked up my phone and called her. Straight to voicemail. I sat there a few more minutes. Long enough for the waiter to come back with a tight smile and ask if I was still waiting. I nodded. He didn't believe me. Neither did I. Eventually, I stood, smoothed the dress over my hips, and walked out past tables full of daughters who were still speaking to their mothers. The hostess gave me a sympathetic smile, the kind people offer to strangers at funerals. I gave her the same smile back. Drove home with the windows down, even though it was cold. Let the night air slap the tears from my cheeks so I wouldn't feel them fall. I hung up the dress as soon as I got home. Put it back in its plastic cover like I was sealing away a memory I should have known better than to resurrect. I didn't cry. Not right away. I just sat on the edge of my bed in that too-quiet house and stared at the phone that never rang again. I arrived at Franco's 5 minutes early this time, just in case, because some tiny hopeful part of me still believed maybe the last dinner had been a mix-up, a mistake, a misunderstanding Amber might laugh about one day when we were back on good terms. I wore the same burgundy dress again, even though part of me hated it now. I told myself it was about consistency, about showing up as the same mother I'd always been. I curled my hair, added a touch of blush, even reapplied lipstick in the car mirror before walking inside. I'd barely stepped past the hostess stand when I saw them. 3 men in navy and charcoal suits, sitting upright and expectant at a corner table near the wall, folders already laid out on the white linen like it was a courtroom, not a restaurant. Amber was seated beside them, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She didn't even look surprised to see me. Just inclined her head slightly, as if I were a client arriving late to a scheduled consultation. My stomach dropped. One of the men stood up and extended his hand before I could process what was happening. He introduced himself as Greg's legal counsel and gestured for me to sit. He said it all very calmly, like this was just another business matter. I slid into the chair slowly, my body moving on autopilot while my brain scrambled to make sense of what I was seeing. I looked at Amber again, my daughter, my only child, and she just stared at me like she didn't recognize me. Like this wasn't the same woman who used to rub Vicks on her chest during flu season and sing her to sleep when she had nightmares about the girl in the well from that awful movie she never should have watched. Then the second lawyer began speaking. He placed a document in front of me and slid a pen across the table like it was a menu. He said it was a limited financial power of attorney, that it would allow Greg, Amber's fiancé, to help manage my assets, retirement funds, and streamline decision-making. He used words like aging gracefully and burden sharing and future planning, and it felt like my skin was trying to peel itself off my bones. I looked at Amber again, waited for her to stop this, to interrupt, to say it was a joke, that this wasn't what it looked like. But she didn't. She just sat there, hands folded neatly in her lap, lips pressed into a thin, flat line that made her look more like her father than I'd ever noticed before. Cold, distant. I asked them what this was really about. The third man, the quiet one who hadn't said anything yet, finally leaned forward and spoke. He didn't bother sugarcoating it. He said that if I refused to sign, I would not be permitted to have contact with my grandson. My world tilted. I stared at him, blinking, because the words didn't make sense in the order he said them. Grandson? Amber hadn't told me she was pregnant. No announcement, no ultrasound, no baby shower invitation. I had no idea there was a child involved. I turned to her, shocked, confused, and I said her name like it might wake her up from whatever spell she was under. She didn't even flinch, just nodded slowly, like this had been the plan all along. She said nothing, not a word. The lawyer clarified that the child, due in the fall, would be protected from potential financial instability, and that this arrangement was in everyone's best interest. I couldn't speak. I couldn't breathe. They kept talking, as if this whole thing had been rehearsed a dozen times behind my back. I stared down at the paper in front of me, this ugly document that might as well have been a funeral program for the last shred of dignity I had left. I pushed back from the table slowly. My hands were shaking. I told them I wasn't signing anything. Not tonight. Not ever. I stood up, knees unsteady, the burgundy fabric suddenly too tight across my ribs. I looked at Amber one last time, searched her face for something familiar. A flicker of regret, or warmth, or the girl who used to kiss my cheek before bedtime and whisper that I was her favorite person in the world. But she just turned away and started sipping her water like I hadn't been there at all. I walked out of the restaurant with my spine stiff, my head high, and my heart in shreds. I didn't cry until I was back in the car, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. I sat there in the parking lot for 15 minutes before I could trust myself to drive. And when I did, I didn't go home right away. I just kept driving, past all the places I used to take Amber when she was little. The carousel, the lake, the ice cream shop with the red benches she loved. Every turn I took, I felt a little more lost. Not geographically, but in the kind of way you don't come back from. I stood outside Franco's with the restaurant lights bleeding through the frosted windows behind me, the sound of clinking glasses and muted laughter hitting my back like static. My hands were trembling, but not from fear. Rage has its own temperature, and I was burning. I pulled out my phone, my fingers stiff and cold, and scrolled until I found Daniel's name. My son. My anchor. I hadn't told him anything yet. He was busy with his residency, and I hadn't wanted to trouble him with what I'd chalked up to family drama. But this wasn't drama. This was war. He answered on the second ring. Mom. I don't know what I sounded like. My voice must have cracked or gone thin around the edges because he immediately said, "Where are you? What happened?" I told him I was at Franco's. I told him Amber had lured me here under the pretense of a dinner and then let Greg's lawyers circle me like vultures, shoving legal documents under my nose and threatening to take my grandchild away unless I handed over control of my finances. I told him that she just sat there, watching, saying nothing, like she didn't even recognize me anymore. There was a pause, just breathing on the other end. Then he said, "Stay right there. I'm on my way." He didn't ask another question. He didn't need to. The way he said it, clipped, low, steady, told me everything I needed to know. He understood exactly what was happening, and he was already moving. It took him 19 minutes to get there. I know because I watched the minutes crawl by on my lock screen like they were daring me to collapse. But I didn't. I stood there, right by the valet station, arms folded tight across my chest, feeling the seams of that stupid burgundy dress cut into my ribs, a fabric reminder of just how naive I'd been. Daniel pulled up in his old Camry, the one he refused to upgrade, even though he could afford it now. He got out still wearing his scrubs, name badge clipped to his chest, hair slightly flattened on one side like he'd ripped off his surgical cap mid-run. His eyes scanned me once, just once, and his jaw clenched. He walked right past me into the restaurant without saying a word. I followed him in and watched as he approached the table like he belonged there. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was clear, cold, surgical. He asked them what the hell they thought they were doing. Greg tried to smile, stammer something about this being a private matter, but Daniel cut him off so cleanly, it was like watching someone carve into a lie with a scalpel. He asked each of the 3 lawyers their names, and then repeated them out loud as he typed them into his phone. They bristled. One of them stood up, tried to regain control of the room, said something about confidentiality and attorney-client privilege. Daniel didn't even blink. He said, "You're sitting in a public restaurant ambushing my mother with predatory financial documents under duress. That's not privilege. That's attempted elder coercion." Amber still hadn't said anything. Not even when Daniel turned to her and said her name, once, quiet and deliberate like he couldn't believe what he was looking at. She flinched, barely, then dropped her gaze to her lap like a scolded child. I watched that moment carefully, not because I wanted to see her break, but because I needed to know if there was anything left of the girl I raised, if there was still a sliver of her that might come back. Daniel picked up the folder they'd laid out in front of me earlier, flipped through it with the detached precision of someone used to analyzing test results that determine life or death, then closed it and slid it across the table like it disgusted him to touch it. He said, "You'll be hearing from our family attorney. Don't contact her again. And if you try to use that child as leverage, I'll personally make sure the court knows exactly what kind of people you are." Then he turned to me, gently touched my elbow, and said, "Let's go, Mom." And just like that, it was over. No yelling, no plates smashed, no public scene. Just quiet devastation and the sound of something permanent snapping in the space between a mother and the daughter she no longer recognized. We walked out together into the night. Daniel opened the passenger door for me like he used to when he was a teenager, trying to prove he could be a gentleman. I slid in slowly, my knees stiff, heart raw, and stared straight ahead while he walked around to the driver's side. As he started the engine, I realized I was still clutching the cloth napkin from the table in my hand. I must have grabbed it without thinking. I held it up, then let it drop into my lap. Just another thing that didn't belong to me anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed with the burgundy dress still folded on the chair by the door like it was watching me, holding the weight of what it had witnessed. My brain kept replaying the look on Amber's face, how she didn't even blink when those men threatened to cut me out of my grandchild's life. And Greg, his smug little smirk, the kind men where when they think they've cornered someone too polite or too soft to push back. They thought I was alone. They thought I was stupid. But I wasn't either of those things. I'd just been quiet. And I wasn't going to stay quiet anymore. At 6:12 a.m., I called Louise. She picked up on the second ring, same as always. Her voice groggy but composed, like someone who sleeps next to a fully loaded legal pad. Louise is 83 years old, a former federal prosecutor turned private estate and family fraud attorney. She doesn't bother with handshakes or small talk. She wears wide-legged trousers and orthopedic loafers and keeps her nails short and painted clear. She also terrifies every man in a suit who's ever underestimated her. I told her everything. She didn't interrupt. She just listened, asked for names, dates, what was said, who was present. When I told her about the power of attorney document and the threat about the baby, her voice went flat. They've been planning this, she said. They tried to corner you before you could speak to legal counsel. That's classic coercion through emotional duress. It's not just unethical, it's disqualifying. She told me not to worry, that she'd handle it. And she did. 2 days later, Louise walked into Franco's like she owned the damn place. I wasn't even with her this time. She went straight to the table where Greg and his legal trio had been eating. Yes, they were back there again, probably trying to spin their version of the encounter into some narrative they could control. I don't know what they expected. Maybe they thought I'd crawl back, embarrassed, desperate, broken. What they got instead was a woman older than all of them put together, wielding a manila folder like a sword and a mouth that didn't soften for anyone. She introduced herself and handed each of them a sealed envelope. Copies of a notice that the attempted coercion had been formally documented and reported. She cited a half-dozen state statutes about elder exploitation and financial manipulation. Then, while Greg's lawyers were still fumbling with their words, she dropped the second bomb. There is a trust, she said, her voice smooth as honey but sharp as glass. It was established 5 years ago. All of Martha's primary assets, home equity, retirement, liquid reserves, are held in that trust. Control of the trust does not reside with Amber or her fiancé. The trustee of record is her son, Dr. Daniel Whitmore. Greg's face went pale. Louise smiled the way wolves smile right before the wind changes. Furthermore, she said, any attempts to interfere with the structure of the trust or to gain unauthorized access to its holdings will be met with civil litigation and a motion for injunctive relief. They tried to interrupt. She held up a hand. Let me finish, she said, and the room listened. She told them that every conversation that had taken place that night at the restaurant had been recorded, that she had copies of the messages Amber sent to lure me there under false pretenses, that the threat about the unborn child was already in writing and had been preserved, that if they attempted anything further, another dinner, another signature request, another pressure tactic, it would go to court. And then she left. No lingering, no gloating, no dramatics. She just turned, adjusted the strap on her bag, and walked out like she had just ordered a sandwich instead of dismantled a fraud in progress. Daniel was waiting in the parking lot. I was sitting in the passenger seat again, watching the front door. I saw Greg come out 10 minutes later, red in the face, jaw clenched, his lawyer trailing behind like deflated shadows. Amber didn't follow them. Not right away. She came out later, alone, holding her phone like it might save her. She looked around the lot like she expected someone to appear and tell her this wasn't really happening. But no one did. She looked smaller than I remembered. And I just sat there beside my son, hands folded in my lap, the trust documents already back in our home safe where they belonged. I'd never wanted to use them. I'd hoped she'd never give me a reason to. But when she did, I was ready. Because I'd raised 2 children. One forgot who I was. The other never let me forget who I am. Greg cracked first. It didn't happen with a bang. No fists pounding tables or chairs being shoved back like in the movies. It was more pathetic than that, more revealing. After Louise calmly laid out the structure of the trust, after she explained with that polished, lethal finality that not only was I not giving them control of anything, but that I never had the intention to in the first place, that all financial decisions were permanently locked under Daniel's trusteeship and couldn't be amended or accessed without going through him. Greg sat there, blinking like he'd just been hit in the face with cold water. He kept looking at Amber, then back at Louise, then at the papers he hadn't even touched. You could almost see the math dissolving in his head. The calculations, the leverage, the dinner invitations, the smile he practiced in the mirror to charm a tired old woman into signing her life away. All of it unraveling. What do you mean she can't? What do you mean Daniel has control? His voice cracked around the edges, no longer polished or persuasive. The bravado peeled off him like cheap wallpaper. Amber said, she said it was all coming to us. That she'd talked to her mom, and it was just paperwork. Louise didn't even flinch. She tilted her head slightly, like she'd seen this exact scene play out more times than she could count. Well, she was mistaken, she said, slowly, each word wrapped in iron. It's not coming to anyone. It never was. The structure was built explicitly to protect against situations like this one. He pushed his chair back, abrupt, sharp against the tile. One of the lawyers said his name under his breath, like trying to call a dog off a fence. But it was too late. Greg was already unraveling in real time, face blotched red and eyes darting around like he could still find a way to claw something back from this. I gave up everything to be with her, he hissed, almost to himself. I had plans. We had, she told me. He looked at Amber again, but this time there was no signal passing between them. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the center of the table like she could crawl into the wood grain and disappear. Her hands were curled in her lap, her shoulders trembling, but she said nothing. Not to him, not to me, not even to herself. Greg turned to me then, his expression somewhere between pleading and fury, and for a split second I almost expected him to beg. But he didn't. He clenched his jaw, shoved his chair in hard enough to rattle the glasses, and stormed past Louise like she wasn't even there. I watched him go without a word. Amber didn't move. She stayed seated while the other lawyers quietly gathered their folders and left behind their untouched drinks, murmuring things to each other with their eyes fixed anywhere but on me or her. One by one they filed out, and still she didn't move. The restaurant was quieter now, not empty but thinning out, the kind of low murmur that makes everything else feel 10 times louder. I stood, gathered my purse, took a long, quiet breath. I didn't look at her right away. I wasn't sure if I could, but something made me turn back. She was crying, not sobbing, not falling apart, just silent tears, slow and steady, rolling down her cheeks like something internal had cracked and finally admitted defeat. Her lips parted slightly, and for a moment I thought she might say something, anything, a protest, an apology, even a whispered why. But she didn't. She just looked at me with wide, wet eyes and nothing behind them but the hollow ache of someone who had lost a game she didn't even realize she was playing with people who loved her. And I didn't say a word. I walked out, head high, shoulders back. No apology, no comfort, just silence. Because sometimes silence is the only language left when love has been worn down to its bones. The days after everything fell apart felt like living in an echo. Quiet, but not peaceful. Familiar, but never comfortable. I moved through my house like it belonged to someone else. The kitchen still smelled faintly of rosemary and lemons, the last dinner I'd made before Amber cut me off. The photos on the mantle, her high school graduation, Daniel in his lab coat, the three of us at the beach when they were little, were like postcards from a life I used to believe in. Some days I'd catch myself setting 2 mugs of tea instead of 1 and feel that pang of instinct collide with reality, sharp and unforgiving. I wasn't sleeping much. Grief does that. Not grief like after a death, but the grief that comes when someone's still alive and they just don't want you anymore. That kind of grief doesn't scream, it seeps. Into the walls, into your bones, into your coffee in the morning and the way you hesitate before answering the phone, hoping maybe this time it's different. Then one afternoon, when I was walking back from the mailbox in my robe and sandals, unshowered, holding 2 catalogs I didn't want and a property tax reminder I'd been ignoring, Janet appeared. She was standing on her front porch in worn jeans and a wide-brimmed hat, pruning a potted rosemary plant like it owed her money. She glanced up, narrowed her eyes behind her oversized sunglasses, and said, "You look like hell." I should have been offended, but there was something so honest about it I almost laughed. "That bad?" I asked. She nodded. "That bad. Come in. I just made apple cake, and I'm too old to eat the whole damn thing by myself." I didn't know much about her at the time. She lived 4 houses down, alone. A widow, I'd heard. People said her husband died 2 years ago and that she'd refused to sell the house, even though it was too big for one person. What I hadn't known was that Janet didn't just live alone. She thrived in it. She'd turned her kitchen into a command center for every pie recipe in the Midwest. Her living room looked like something out of a vintage cookbook shoot, full of heavy drapes, mismatched chairs, and enough throw pillows to suffocate a grown man. That first afternoon, we didn't talk about anything serious. Just nonsense. What our mail carriers did wrong. The weather. A neighborhood raccoon that had apparently made a habit of stealing her wind chimes. I didn't realize until I got home that I'd spent 3 hours there. And for the first time in weeks, I hadn't thought about Amber. It became a rhythm after that. Fridays were antique shop days. We'd take my car because hers smelled like sadness and menthol. She'd comb through dusty glass cases like she was searching for a secret, haggling with vendors who clearly didn't stand a chance. I started picking up little pieces here and there, an Art Deco lamp, a porcelain figurine of a woman reading a book, a chipped blue vase I told myself I'd fix and never did. Tuesdays were cooking days. I brought the wine, she made the food. We started simple, soups, pasta, the kind of hearty stuff that fills the house with steam and garlic and the illusion of being cared for. Eventually, we started trading off. I taught her my rosemary chicken. She showed me her grandmother's potato pancakes. We'd eat at her kitchen table, surrounded by cookbooks and folded linen napkins, and talk about nothing and everything. I told her about Amber, about the restaurant, the lawyers, the silence that followed. She didn't interrupt. She just poured more wine and said, "You loved someone who stopped deserving it. That doesn't make you a fool. It makes you human." We started talking about plans, small ones at first. Fixing up the backyard. Maybe repainting the old guest room. I told her I'd always wanted to take a pottery class, but never had the nerve. She said she wanted to learn French, not to travel, just to be difficult at the grocery store. We made a list, hung it on her fridge, called it the second bloom. There's something quietly radical about rebuilding your life not with noise or defiance, but with gentleness, with shared meals, with the clink of thrift store teacups and the slow redefinition of what family even means. I don't know what comes next. I'm still grieving. That hasn't changed. But the grief no longer owns me. Now, some days, I catch myself setting 2 mugs of tea again. And this time, I do it on purpose. It started with a pamphlet. I found it at the library, wedged between the new mystery releases and a flyer for chair yoga. The title was Plain Financial Exploitation of Seniors. Know the signs, but it stopped me in my tracks. I picked it up without thinking, held it like it might be warm. On the front was a stock photo of a woman who looked vaguely like me, older, kind-eyed, sitting across from someone who was clearly her son and clearly lying to her. I slipped it into my tote bag and brought it home, read it over coffee the next morning with a pen in my hand and a tightness in my chest I couldn't name. That was how it began. A few days later, I called the number on the back. It connected me to a small nonprofit across town that offered legal advocacy and emotional support for older adults dealing with fraud, abuse, or manipulation, usually at the hands of family. I didn't plan to do anything beyond asking some questions. I thought maybe I'd offer to stuff envelopes, bring in muffins for one of their workshops. But then I met Evelyn. She ran their outreach office out of a converted church basement, the kind with old linoleum floors and bulletin boards half-faded from years of tack pins and sun. She was sharp, maybe late 60s, with cropped silver hair and a binder full of names. I told her a little about what had happened with Amber and Greg. I didn't even get through all of it before she closed the folder in front of her and said, "We could use you." I didn't think I had anything to offer. I wasn't a lawyer or a therapist or even someone particularly well-versed in legislation. But Evelyn said what people needed wasn't credentials. They needed someone who understood the ache, who'd sat across the table from a child they once carried in their arms and heard words they never thought possible, who'd felt that mix of shame and fury and helplessness and come out the other side with her spine still intact. So I showed up, once a week at first, then more. I helped with intake forms, organized group meetups, called older women who hadn't left their homes in weeks and just needed to hear another voice. I sat in on sessions where people described the same script I'd lived through. Trust turned into leverage, love turned into blackmail, their own homes suddenly feeling like traps. One woman had signed over her entire pension to her grandson. Another had co-signed a loan she didn't understand. And more than a few had been lured into fake asset management deals by their own sons-in-law. Every story was different, but the thread was the same. Betrayal in the place where safety used to live. Eventually, I asked if I could start a group. Not a therapy circle. Just a place where people could come, sit, and speak without being rushed or judged or pitted. We called it Second Safeguard. I didn't expect more than a handful of attendees. But on the first evening, 23 people showed up. One man brought his entire file cabinet in a box. Another woman sat in the back with her sunglasses on the whole time, silent until the very end, when she whispered. I thought I was the only one. We talked about bank statements and wills and durable powers of attorney, but we also talked about grief. About how to hold on to dignity when your own child tells you you're in the way. We talked about starting over at 70, about building boundaries with people you once changed diapers for, about how to forgive yourself when you realize love doesn't always mean access. I didn't plan any of it. I just followed the pull. I started printing out resource sheets, finding pro bono legal help, connecting people with elder rights attorneys and social workers. Daniel helped me set up a proper filing system and walked me through online security protocols. Janet came sometimes too, bringing snacks and sitting quietly near the coffee urn, offering tart little one-liners that broke tension like glass under a heel. And slowly, my days began to fill with something that felt like purpose again. Not the kind you put on a resume, but the kind that gets you out of bed when everything else feels too heavy. I found myself looking forward to the voices, to the stories, even to the hard parts, the silence, the breakdowns, the rage that always came just before the clarity. It was familiar terrain. And this time, I wasn't walking it alone. People started calling me Mrs. Whitmore, the one who knows what to do. I never corrected them. I didn't always know what to do, but I knew how to stay standing. And sometimes, that's all someone needs, to see you standing and know they can too. A few weeks after I sent the letter, another envelope arrived. Plain white this time. No frills, no embellishments. Just my name in that same familiar handwriting, careful and round, like she was trying to keep her hand from shaking while writing it. Inside was a photo of the baby, Eleanor, maybe a month old now, with wide, dark eyes and a little crease between her brows that reminded me so painfully of Amber at that age it almost knocked the air out of me. She was wrapped in a lavender blanket, tiny fingers curled against her cheek, peaceful in that way only infants can be, untouched by all the fractures around them. The note was written on a small folded card, just a few lines. "She's beautiful, Mom. Her name is Eleanor Grace. We really want you to meet her. No expectations. Just family." But even through the softness of the words, I could feel the shape of what wasn't being said. There was nothing direct about money, nothing explicit, but the timing was too familiar. Amber's way had always been to wait until things cooled, until distance softened memory, then slide her ass between layers of sentiment. And the baby's name, Eleanor, was never just a name. It was my mother's. A name Amber used to make fun of when she was a teenager, calling it old and heavy. And now, suddenly, it was her daughter's. It was a key, or so they thought. A baited hook. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time with the photo in front of me. I couldn't deny what I felt. She was mine. My blood. My granddaughter. There was a part of me, raw and maternal, that wanted to rush toward her. To hold her. To rock her. To press my cheek against hers and pretend there was no Greg, no lawyers, no documents, no broken trust. Just the baby and the chance to start over. But fantasy doesn't make anything real. And I knew exactly what would happen if I stepped back in on their terms. So I wrote again. I didn't wait this time. No brooding, no drafting 6 versions. I knew what I needed to say. "Amber, thank you for the photo. She's beautiful. You were beautiful too, once, in the same exact way." I recognized the face. I even recognized the silence beneath your words. Let me be clear. I will not have any further discussions involving finances. Not directly, not indirectly. I've set my boundaries, and I will not be guilt, coaxed, or maneuvered past them, no matter how carefully wrapped the invitation may be. I'm open to knowing Eleanor, but I will not be re-entering a situation where love is used as a transaction. If you want to rebuild something real, it starts with truth, and it stays far, far away from money. If you're willing to meet on those terms, neutral place, no Greg, no agenda, I'm here. If not, then I wish you well. But I won't step back into the fire to prove anything. Martha. I sealed it, walked it to the mailbox, and didn't look back. The folding chairs in the basement don't match. Some creak when you shift your weight. The coffee is usually lukewarm by the time everyone sits down, and someone always forgets to bring sugar. But the room fills every time. New faces, old ones. People who arrive with their shoulders drawn tight and their eyes scanning the exits, like they're waiting to be tricked again. I know that feeling. I used to walk into spaces like that with my palms sweating, thinking if I said the wrong thing, it would somehow confirm everything they'd made me feel, that I was foolish, naive, too soft, too trusting. That what happened to me was my fault. But I don't think that way anymore. These days, I stand at the front of the room with my papers in one hand and a black binder in the other. I wear flats that don't pinch, and I no longer shrink when I speak. The group is larger now than it was in the beginning. Some of the people here have lost tens of thousands. Others were isolated, gaslit, nearly institutionalized by the very family they raised. They talk about forged signatures, vanished retirement accounts, relatives who sweet-talked them into giving up homes, names on deeds, medical access. Every week, the same quiet confession appears in some new voice. I thought I was the only one. And every week, I remind them they're not. I tell them what happened to me, not just the facts, but the silence that followed, the grief no one brings casseroles for. I tell them how I sat across from my own daughter while lawyers tried to take everything I had built and repackage it in her fiancé's name. I tell them how I walked out of that restaurant with my spine intact, and how, for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what it meant to choose yourself, even when it cost you the people you once loved most. Last Tuesday, I stood up in front of the group and said something I hadn't dared to say out loud until then. I am no longer a victim. The room went still. You could hear someone's bracelet clink against their chair. I looked around at the faces, some tearful, some guarded, all listening. I said it again, slower this time. I am not a victim. I am an example of how a woman can stand her ground. I am proof that you can lose everything they try to take from you and still have yourself, still have your voice, still have the truth. And they believed me. There was no applause. That's not what this space is for. But one woman stood up after me and said it too. Then another. The third one cried when she said it, but her voice didn't shake. That's what survival looks like sometimes. Quiet, unapologetic, complete. At night, when the lights are off and the dishes are done, I sit on my porch with a blanket across my lap and tea cooling beside me. I still think of Eleanor, of the soft weight she must be by now, of what she might sound like when she laughs. I think of Amber too, what she did, what she chose. I don't pretend it doesn't hurt.